As polls show that the Tories are miles behind the Labour Party, it's unlikely that they will be forming the next government. With that in mind, maybe that's why the Reform Party have announced that they will stand candidates in every seat at the next election. What's there to lose, right? The Tories won't win anyway. Why not use this for political capital? If you haven't heard of Reform, it's another right-wing party that was formerly the Brexit Party, headed by Nigel Farage. Now, since being called the Brexit Party is no longer relevant, to keep up their grift, they decided to change their name. The leader, Richard Tice, is a businessman and property developer, a real working-class spokesman. Their website shows that they support lower taxes, secure borders, cheaper energy, and zero waiting lists. There hasn't been any concrete policies apart from right-wing talking points. However, they have been surging in the polls, largely down to the fact that the right-wing news channel GB News are giving them more airtime. Curtis, should the Tories be worried? Have Reform got much traction?
Well, immediately, I think the Conservatives need to be worried about the Labour Party. Looking at the polls, they're set to be wiped out in the next election. Potentially, they could go down to 200 seats. I'm not sure if that's the case. I think polls are probably over-predicting Labour, but they certainly will form the next government. However, at the next election and beyond, Reform, the party, could have an effect. Why? Well, when Conservative and right-wing parties run out of ideas, and I argue that the Conservative Party have never had any ideas, but when they run out of ideas on things to say about the economy, for example, they have nothing to say on the economy. Like, look what's happening right now. We're in a cost of living crisis. We're in an energy crisis. And the Conservatives are just making it worse. And we saw what happened with Liz Truss. So they have nothing to say, nothing to offer. When this happens with right-wing parties, their go-to is to wade into or move into culture wars. They'll start talking about wokeism. They'll start talking about refugees and immigrants and trans people. And that gets people angry and riled up. And that's usually a quite effective way to combat the opposition. However, this could be worrying since I believe the Reform Party, which, by the way, I need to make the point, Reform is not anything new. It's just another right-wing party, another Thatcherite party, right? You look on the website, it says things such as tougher on immigration. Which party isn't now trying to be tougher on immigration? Labour, the Tories, they all sound the same. So, and then their economic policy will be Thatcherite to its core. It will be. It will support privatisation of our public services that are already, publicly owned. It will support further privatisation in the NHS. They will support cutting taxes for the rich. Nothing will change. However, I think they'll wade into the culture war much more effectively because they're willing to go a bit further. In the Conservative Party, there are some, more, I say not really a liberal wing, more of a one nation centrist Tory. I don't know. Someone who's a bit more conscious on the way they look. Didn't like the way that Boris Johnson was governing. Don't like the way that Suella Braverman is saying some disgusting things, and Priti Patel. They try and be a bit more liberal in their outlook on social issues, right? There's some that still exist in the Conservative Party, which kind of stops the Tories from going really, really hard in culture wars. Reform don't have that. And I can see them really leaning into it, which means that just completely removed the weapon of the Conservative Party. So the Tories could be completely irrelevant. They have nothing to say on, obviously, the economy. They'll be out of power. And they'll be outflanked to the right on social issues and culture war issues. So in that sense, yeah, I think Reform could be dangerous. Now, the reason why Reform, and you've mentioned it as well, are kind of surging in the polls, not because of any particular political commentary or any particular successful campaigning, is simply because they've appeared on GB News more. I'd say Reform Party is just the GB News party. GB News and a lot of right-wing outlets are those of the right wing of the Conservatives. And Reform is just a whole party of very right-wing Conservatives. There is no... That's why they're platforming them a lot. And it's incredibly dangerous because what we'll see is the political debate going further to the right. Because the Labour Party are utter cowards. They won't stand by their principles. They will happily move towards the right to try and stay relevant. That means the political window will move to the right. Reform Party be really, really reactionary, right wing. It's going to force the Conservatives to try and become more reactionary, even though they might be out of power. And the Labour Party will just follow on and they'll become even more right wing. So that's when you have an instance, because the political debate has gone so far to the right, that someone like Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, they were seen as hard left communists, which is utterly insane. That's not the case. That iteration of the Labour Party was a centre-left social democratic party. It wasn't hard left. Pick up Jeremy Corbyn, stick him in Northern Europe, and he'll be seen as a centrist politician. Because many places in Europe, I mean, there's a lot of, obviously, far-right nationalism, but there are many places in Northern Europe that their whole political debate, especially in terms of the economy, hasn't gone to the right as much as we have. So I think that is very dangerous for the political debate. I don't think Reform will necessarily win many seats. I don't think they're going to be that successful electorally. You think about UKIP. They've only ever had one MP, but they won millions of votes. And arguably, UKIP wasn't set out to win seats. It didn't need to win seats because despite only having one representative, they managed to change the political discourse. When the Brexit referendum happened, David Cameron was the Prime Minister. He and his Conservative Party in the front bench wanted to remain. Within a couple of months, the party revolutionised itself and they were like hard Brexiteers. UKIP did that. In fact, UKIP created the referendum. So they've done so much, I'd say damage, but they've done, and Nigel Farage and UKIP are very successful in the political discourse with only winning one seat. I can see Reform doing that, and that's their goal. I don't think they want to win many seats.
Yeah.
But the political debate will go even further to the right because Reform are even more right-wing.
That's really interesting to think about, this discussion of, Reform wanting to just push it further to the right. And it's almost like there's walls on either side of the political spectrum, and as Reform push further right that way, it's then pushing inwards from the left, and it's pushing Labour further.
So what
over.
you've just described is something that exists. It's called the Overton window.
Oh, okay. Smart.
I like your fancy name. What was it? Just walls and moving.
Just moving the walls. Yeah.
Moving the walls. That's a good one. Moving the walls. We're going to call it turn left exclusive. Moving the walls is our new term. So the Overton window is essentially what you described. And for people who don't know, the Overton window essentially things that 40, 50 years ago was considered radical, insane, today are considered normal. And things that were considered normal, pretty normal and centrist and whatever, back then is considered radical. Why? Because the political debate has moved to the right. So I'd say in the 60s and 70s, the main consensus of government was a strong intervention in the economy. It was higher taxation. And remember, under Margaret Thatcher, the top rate of tax was 70%. The same thing happened in the US. Actually, during the 50s and 60s, I think maybe the 70s, the top marginal rate of tax was 90%. Yet there were still incredibly wealthy people. Now, we're talking about cutting taxes from 50% to 45% is what Liz Truss tried to do, right? And if you were to think about saying maybe higher taxes to 60 and 70%, imagine the outcry. But that's what we had under a very right-wing government under Margaret Thatcher years ago. So that's the Overton window. And it completely alludes to what I said about Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn and his politics and policies back in those days weren't particularly radical. I mean, remember in 1945, I say remember, in the history books, because we're not that old, Clement Attlee and his government created the NHS and the welfare state. That was radical, but it was much needed. We can't even get a whiff of anything like that today because it's seen as hard left commie. So yeah, the Overton window has moved already so far to the right that you're getting idiots on GB News tweeting saying that the left in this country and the Labour Party are just hard left wokeists. There's nothing hard left about them. There's nothing remotely left about them. And yes, the growth of Reform and the fact that the Labour Party are so weak and pathetic and scared of their own shadow, they'll be happy to allow the debate to go to the right if they think it means they'll gain electorally. It will mean that the political debate will go even further to the right, and that's dangerous.
Didn't Keir Starmer say something in this last week about how we need to become less dependent on migrant workers and that kind of thing? That's actually quite, I think that's quite shocking to hear from the Labour Party leader.
Yes, of course it is. And that's actually outflanked the Conservatives. Well, some Conservatives were or will be thinking that because the Labour are trying to outflank to the right. And this is what's so dangerous because think about this for a second. Keir Starmer is still in opposition, right? For all the polls and for all of the media love bombing of Keir Starmer, he's not actually won an election yet. Therefore, he's no closer to power than Jeremy Corbyn was. In fact, Jeremy Corbyn, all right, 2019 was a catastrophe, but in 2017 he gained seats, right? So he was technically closer to power. Regardless, Corbyn, Keir Starmer are basically the same in terms of how close they're to power because they're both in opposition. The political debate under Jeremy Corbyn, though, was far different because he was willing to widen the debate. He was willing to stand by his principles and not allow the political debate to go far to the right. Incidentally, a lot of people's attitude changed on immigration and people on benefits drastically within like a year of Corbyn being leader. Why? Because he was willing to tackle these issues head on without being reactionary and offering right-wing solutions. So we talk about immigration and say, right, okay, but we need immigration. Look at the health service. Who is, if you've ever had an operation or you're seeing people from all across the world helping you. We need these people. But there are areas where maybe certain constituencies are feeling the impact of immigration a bit more than others. Therefore, we're going to set up something called a migrant impact fund. We're just going to add more funding rather than being strict on immigration or scapegoat them. In terms of benefits, Rachel Reeves, who's currently the Shadow Chancellor, 5 years ago said, we're not the party of benefits. We want people to get into work. Essentially being completely right-wing and dog-whistling on people benefits. What did Jeremy Corbyn say? He said, no, the welfare state is not fit for purpose. Universal credit is disgusting. People are dying. But the issue isn't people on benefits. The issue is the real wealth hoarders in this country, which is CEOs, which is billionaires, which is the corporations that are not paying any taxes. Again, he took on the benefit question and the debate around it head on, right? He didn't ignore it or sidestep it. He took it head on, but then offered a progressive analysis. So, under Keir Starmer, because he's not willing to do any of these things, the political debate is more right-wing. So you could say, actually, the political landscape was far better under Jeremy Corbyn than it is today.
I think so.
Do you not think?
Yeah,
it is.
and I think it's actually
true.
really scary to think how, in a fairly short space of time, how far like the conversation and the discourse and stuff has shifted to the right. And it's not just here, it's in America, it's in Europe, it's all over. And it is actually really, it's, I guess in some ways when you haven't got an opposition leader with a backbone, that's when that's when it starts to shift. And it is very dangerous because then obviously people who rely on these political leaders to shape their political opinion, if their opinions start to shift and change, so will the general public.
Exactly.
And then, then you get into this awful space.
It basically takes
hatred and
to go on the term. It takes two people to tango, right? So in a political debate, it can only work if both sides accept it, because then it's shown as legitimate, right? If the Conservatives want to go really, really right wing, then you're going to get a portion of people they'll take with them. But you can say, look, these guys have just lost their heads, haven't they? Right? But if the Labour Party or opposition party or a progressive party accept a lot of those arguments, then most people think, oh, well, I guess that's just the sensible. That's okay. That's a sensible opinion. So it takes. You could say the Labour Party are just as much to blame as the Tories when it comes to the debate being more right wing, because Labour don't care. They think, well, we will be as right wing as you want us to be, as long as we can get into power. But that doesn't matter, because when they get into power, they're just going to govern as right wingers. And
you can't really have a centre point anymore, because if both sides are shifting, then so's that centre point.
There's no such thing as a centre ground. Yeah. It is a complete myth. It's what the whole of the media actually cannot understand, or maybe refuse to understand. There's no such thing as a centre ground, because the centre ground is always shifting. Yeah. Right? As I just said, with the Overton window, that is essentially the so-called centre ground. Now, you can't have a centre ground. You can't have a solid centre ground if it changes all of the time. So when you say, well, Labour needs to appeal to the centre ground, what is that? Because the centre ground 50 years ago isn't the same today. Yeah, I would argue
the centre ground now is not even the same as it was 5 years ago.
Exactly,
or 6 years ago.
So the centre ground is essentially what politicians make of it. Yeah. Now, I would say actually, if there is a centre ground, we try and want to somehow find. Well, let's look at policies that the majority of people support. The majority of people support increased taxation on the rich. The majority of people support renationalising the NHS, all of our public services, energy, water, mail, even 50% of the people support renationalising our banks or a publicly owned bank. Not just lefties, we're talking about conservative voters too. So if you want to find the centre ground, maybe it's that, which is exactly what the Corbyn manifesto essentially was. That was the real centre ground, really.
The centre ground really should be what the majority vote is, because then you're always going to have people who then are either more left or more right of whatever the majority thinks. So the centre ground should be the majority.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't know, our majority at the minute, really, the way it's reported, seems radical left.
Exactly. And then what really annoys me is that you're getting people in the top of the Labour Party now said, yeah, we're like the true centre-left mainstream Labour Party. You're not centre-left, you're not centrist, you're centre-right.
Yeah.
You've engaged in this debate. You were joining in on the attacks in the media saying that, socialists are somehow really like hard left.
Yeah.
You cannot say that socialists are hard left when literally the party was created by socialists and by trade unions.
But then also kind of almost that in itself shapes people's opinion, because then if they think if they have these if they agree with any of the points you've just said about renationalising like the NHS and public services and and better like social security and benefit systems and blah blah blah, if they all agree with that, but then you go and say to them, oh well, having that opinion makes you a socialist, and they go, I'm not a socialist, and then they don't want to be put into that bracket because that word has very negative like connotations when it comes to like the media, the way it's described in the media or the way it's described by politicians and stuff. So then it's almost forcing them to change their opinion on things because they just don't want to be put into what they think is a radical viewpoint.
That's why we need the role of journalism and the role of the media is to find objective truth, right? Not both sides, a lot of issues. You need an objective analysis of reality. And it's just simply not a reality that socialists are somehow beyond the pale in this radical left. Look at the manifestos of the last Labour Party. You look it in there, most people are like, yes, pretty bang on. Might not agree with everything, but no one's going to be, oh my God, this is communism. But that's what's happening. And now with the growth of something like Reform, the growth of right-wing media channels like GB News, where they're saying things that even like a Keir Starmer Labour Party is hard left, it's like you've lost all hope.
Yeah. It's actually ridiculous. Because some of the things that Keir Starmer have said recently, they didn't sound wrong coming out of a Rishi Sunak's mouth or a Boris Johnson or whoever. Like there are many things at the minute that seem like there is really no difference between Labour and the Conservative Party, and it's a worrying climate. As we sort of said, the conversation is all shifting to the right. What can we do as individuals or voters or whatever to kind of stop that from happening if it's possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one to answer, really, because it's a big question. What I will say is that the political right, porno punchers, they're brave. They will start political parties. They will happy to stand candidates in seats. They have done. They did it with the Brexit Party. They did it with UKIP. The left, oh God, they cower inside the Labour Party and they say, that's it. The Labour Party hate you. They don't want you in there. That's true. They don't. They hate socialists.
Brutal.
It is brutal, but it's a brutal regime under Keir Stalin. So I'm thinking, well, look, the Labour Party are miles ahead in the polls. They're gonna win a majority, right? If right-wing parties are looking at the Conservatives and thinking, well, they're not going to win, so we need to start a party or really push ahead with an existing party because there's nothing to lose. That is the mentality, I think, of the left. Now, I understand first past the post. I'm not one to usually support smaller parties. The only party I would probably support is the Greens because they are well established and they have a seat and they're going to do well in Bristol potentially. Although there's some issues of transphobia in there. But usually I'm not being so quick to look at smaller parties and with people saying, oh, let's get a new Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party. I think it's fantasy. But as I just said, the Labour Party are so far ahead in the polls. Actually, what is there to lose, really? Now, there are smaller parties out there that haven't gained traction. That's because they haven't had union backing. And I'm thinking the unions, the big unions, maybe they should be looking at this. If the political right are happy to do so, and they don't need to win seats, as we've discussed, that how UKIP and the Brexit Party have been so influential in the political debate, which has led, the political debate to move to the right, then a left-wing or a socialist smaller party, I think, with some unions should exist. I think right now it would be beneficial. Maybe it wins seats, maybe it doesn't, but it could potentially claw back the political debate to some form of sensibleness in this utter chaos of right-wing misery. And it might scare the Labour Party as well, because they deserve it. But they might think, actually, they could split our vote. Maybe they might start listening to working class people. Maybe they might start listening to unions again. And for those that say, well, it's splitting the vote to get the Tories in, well, you can't use that argument anymore, because it's very, very likely Labour will win. If they lost a few seats to a smaller party, or if they lost a few seats to the Conservatives or the Lib Dems because the vote's been split, I don't think it's going to change the outcome of the general election. But it's not about electoral victory, right? Because it's all about political ideas.
It's about having a voice.
Right. And the Labour right and the centrists are hell-bent on electoral victory at any costs, right?
Whereas the right they're just more like Reform don't have that issue of, splitting the Conservative Party, because at the end of the day, they've got the same kind of viewpoint, all right, and the same, goal, I suppose, in terms of like conversation and policies and whatever. And they don't have that concern of splitting the party, but the left, Labour Party and the left feel
and the thing is, like, UKIP had negotiations with the Conservatives, right? I'm not saying that Labour would listen to any kind of socialist party; they wouldn't. But UKIP were like, we'll stand all candidates, and then they were satisfied in the direction the Conservative Party went. And they said, okay, we're going to not stand candidates in every seat. There needs to be leverage. There needs to be accountability. There clearly is some kind of accountability for right-wing parties, right? The Conservatives obviously feel like there is a niche of right-wing people, or there's forces that feel like they need to go appeal to the right. There's nothing on the left. There's nothing from the Labour Party that tells them we need to be more left-wing. There isn't. And I think there needs to be that leverage. So I personally think there really should be a potential party set up, but with unions being involved, because there are parties such as Breakthrough that hasn't really gained traction. Northern Independence Party's gone nowhere. The Greens are kind of somewhere, but again, they've only got one seat. There really needs to be a vehicle of balancing the political debate, and I think they should pressure the Labour Party. I think it's really important.